Is the European Union in danger? EU foreign ministers hold a crisis meeting after Britain's voted to leave the 28-member bloc. But what does it take to keep the EU together? And how can it prevent others from leaving? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Richelle Carey. A day after British voters decided to leave the European Union, the consequences are slowly coming into focus. Nationalist politicians across Europe are now pushing for their own countries to leave the EU. France's far-right leader Marine Le Pen says French citizens must also have the right to choose. She joins other nationalist and anti-immigration politicians in the Netherlands and Italy in calling for an EU referendum. That is likely worrying European foreign ministers meeting in Germany to discuss Brexit and what it means for the EU's future. We have a lot to discuss today. But first, Mohammed Val has this report from Berlin.
Obviously, the Brexit vote has left European leaders with some very difficult issues to deal with. And that's why the foreign ministers of the 6 founding members have met here today in the German capital, Berlin, to discuss a future plan for Europe. A paper has been introduced by France and Germany talking about those issues and bringing to the table some broad lines that can be followed to make sure the European system is more flexible, to make sure that it gives more space to individual member states in terms of deciding on their own internal policies and leave those issues of common concern to be discussed by the EU or decided on by the EU system. Also, EU leaders have to deal with another situation, which is how to make the exit of the UK smooth and beneficial for both sides. The EU has this problem of how to deal with this, because if they give the UK a very favourable deal once it is out of the system, they run the risk of encouraging other nations of following suit. But also they don't want to punish the UK because the UK is very much economically and politically linked to the rest of the continent.
EU leaders have urged member states to remain calm. Germany's foreign minister says the UK breaking away is a chance to prove the EU's resilience.
Den festen Willen geäußert, dass wir
We have the firm will to keep Europe together. This is our first and foremost joint task. We must seize this opportunity to listen to one another. We do not have all the answers for all the questions. These answers are something we need to prepare jointly. This is an opportunity for the EU states to demonstrate to the people that Europe is necessary and reliable.
Some European politicians have said the EU needs to reform if it wants to stay together. Former Polish Prime Minister Jarosław Kaczynski says the conclusion is obvious. We need a new European treaty. We need a positive reaction and not persistent movement in the same direction, a direction which has led to crisis. All right, let's bring in our guests now. In Brussels, Pieter Cleppe, who heads the Brussels office of the Open Europe think tank. In Paris, Patrice, the former editor of the Monde newspaper. And joining us on Skype from Passau in Germany is Florian Hartleb, a lecturer at Eichstatt University, where he specializes in populism, political parties, and leadership within the EU. And welcome to all of you, gentlemen. A lot to talk about. And Florian, I want to start with you. Is this a done deal?
It's an open process which takes a long time for the next years, and it shows basically that populism and Euroscepticism is on the rise, and it's a mainstream phenomenon in European politics.
Okay, and we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. But first, Patrice, the founding members of EU have been very measured in their tone so that people don't panic or they aren't too angry. Their words matter here, but they've also been very firm in saying they want this process to start as quickly as possible. Is it more beneficial to get this thing going, or is there a reason to really be slow and methodical about this?
Well, of course, it takes time for people to realize what has been happening and to digest, if I may say so, the decision taken by the United Kingdom if they have taken a real decision, because this remains to be seen according to what we've seen in the last few hours. But it is true that at the same time, governments and institutions within Europe have to react very quickly, very decisively, to show that this is not the unraveling of Europe, but just one of the major countries leaving the EU. And the time is not anymore for political or constitutional changes, discussions, endless discussion about widening or deepening of the EU. What people want, if they want to remain within the EU, is concrete decisions. And the main question, I would say, for the French, but probably for all other Europeans, is the question of security. Security of borders with the problem of immigration, job security, security in social issues, economic security, and environmental security. I would say security is the key word if we want to be able to cope with this crisis, which is not as simple as England leaving the EU or staying in the EU.
So you're saying that this leaving has really forced a lot of issues to the forefront that you think should be addressed. But you said something a moment ago, alluded to the fact that you don't necessarily think this is a done deal. Could you explain?
Well, England, the UK had one foot in and one foot out till the day before yesterday. And it seems that some British politicians, starting with the present Prime Minister David Cameron and the leader of the Brexit campaign, Boris Johnson, seem to have some second thoughts. Boris Johnson has said that he was not very much in a hurry, that Britain, after all, was a country, a European country. Then you hear about Tory politicians say, well, we are sorry, we voted for Brexit because we thought it would never be voted. So what should we do now? And some people are backtracking. And it looks like a bad replay of Shakespearean tragedy with a lot of sound and fury and unpredictable income. And the British are very good at playing on those things.
Peter, do you agree with that assessment that it seems like there's, I don't know, maybe a bit of buyer's remorse, maybe a bit of denial, a lot of confusion about what's going on and what's going to happen next?
Yeah, well, with regards to the meeting in Berlin, the foreign ministers of the 6 founding member states, of course, they can send out all kinds of communiques, but that doesn't change the fact that the UK has a veto and the full capacity to decide whether it will trigger and when it will trigger negotiations to leave the European Union. It can also decide whether it will use the EU's procedure to do that, or whether it will pick another procedure.
Florian, let's talk about these negotiations. This is an area that really no one has ever been down this path before. What do you think the overarching motivations are going to be during these negotiations? Because the EU kind of has competing interests. You know, they don't want to go too soft on the UK in the interest of making sure other countries perhaps don't want to go down this path, but you don't necessarily want to punish them, because is there maybe a way to have a mutually beneficial relationship for all of them without necessarily having the formality of the UK being in the EU?
Now, first of all, the EU has to find a common line. This is a big challenge. We already have seen now that Angela Merkel, the decisive figure, she has another opinion than Jean-Claude Juncker, the president of the European Commission, about the speed. First of all, in this divorce, UK has to play its own cards on the table, and this is not easy because we know that David Cameron will resign. And first of all, it's also clear now that there's no clear strategy from both sides behind it, and this is why it will be a big mess for the both sides.
And in fact, Angela Merkel did say today that the UK has to be clear about what it is they want. And you're saying that that's not even necessarily clear?
It's not necessarily clear. And what is clear right now, what we know from the EU side is that the EU has to deal, what was already discussed before, with the decisive question of security and with the refugee crisis. And the other thing is that the EU can't go forward with a deepening process. The philosophy of the EU is basically, or of the European integration, too deep, from the Roman treaties over Maastricht until now. That's not possible anymore, and we are going to have a more flexible EU and with maybe a new possibility for sanctions. We already discussed in the Greek crisis how to deal with countries which are not following the rules, and now we have to deal with a country who actually has stepped out of the EU.
So, Peter, if you go too hard on the UK, is there some way that that could backfire?
Well, it's obviously a very bad idea to try to punish Britain. I know that some great strategists in the European Commission think this is a good idea, but they don't seem to understand it will backfire. For example, if you would restrict the access that British financial services have to the continent, obviously this will first of all drive up the cost of investment for consumers on the continent. It will also drive up the cost of borrowing of European governments, and most importantly, Britain would retaliate. It would impose tariffs on things like German cars. Obviously this would cost a lot of jobs and everyone would lose from that. You should also ask yourself the question, should we really try to convince people to stay in the EU based on this kind of setting an example and punishing those wanting to leave? I don't think so. I think you should try to convince countries to stay in the EU based on positive elements. Now, if we look, why are people so angry with the European project, not only in Britain but also on the continent? I think it's pretty clear. People are not angry that Brussels is trying to make sure that companies like Ryanair can operate all over the continent and offer cheap flights to ordinary people. But people don't like when Brussels intervene into very sensitive areas of democracy. For example, national budgets, or when Brussels is organizing fiscal transfers between countries, or when Brussels tries to meddle in something as sensitive as asylum policy. So I think the previous speaker mentioned that Brussels has to provide security. Well, obviously nothing is as secure as a prison, and obviously that's not the way to go. What Brussels needs to do is to focus on what is very popular at the moment, which is to removing barriers to trade, and it should stop intervening into very sensitive issues like budget policy or transfers or asylum policy.
So, Peter, you just mentioned this. To varying degrees, there are other countries in Europe that vary from just being frustrated to flat out saying we want a referendum as well. It varies, and we have been seeing lots of far-right politicians across Europe who commended UK on its choice to leave the EU. Let's listen to a little bit of that and we'll pick it up on the other side.
Only a few months ago, no one could see that, yes, it is possible to leave the European Union. The British people have given to the people of the world and the EU a tremendous lesson in democracy. The UK has not given in to fear or the apocalyptic predictions that were dangled in front of it. It has chosen freedom.
The British people defeated the political elite in Brussels both and in London, and now they are in charge again. They are a national sovereign country again and in charge of their own borders, their own immigration policy, their own budget and their own money, and I can only congratulate them with this excellent result. And I believe that the offspring will be that other countries, like my own country, the Netherlands, where the majority of the people want the Nexit or at least a referendum about a possible Nexit as well, that will come as well. So today is the beginning of the end of the European Union, but more important, the beginning of what I always call a patriotic spring the revival of the nation states in Europe.
Now, obviously, it remains to be seen if this is the beginning of the end of the EU. But he did have a point. There was a survey on Dutch television station that said 54% of people in the Netherlands want a referendum of their own. It seems that Marine Le Pen does have some support as well. In Italy, the Five Star Movement has called to at least reassess the country's relationship with the EU, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Florian, where do you see this movement getting the most traction?
Actually, we have right-wing populist parties successfully campaigning with two topics which are decisive. First of all, with the fear of Islam, and secondly, with Euroscepticism. Europe, no thanks. But this is not a unique movement. For example, Viktor Orban, the Hungarian leader, supported that the UK should stay in the EU. And in most of the countries, still, the right-wing populist parties have no majority. Almost, of course, in Austria, they got the presidency. But generally, the establishment shouldn't be too much worrying about these things. I don't think that this British case now is an example for the beginning of a long story, because the Euroscepticism in the UK is something unique and has a long tradition if you think on Margaret Thatcher and the British approach towards the EU.
Patrice, do you agree with that assessment? Actually, Patrice, if you can hold just a moment. I saw Pieter shaking his head. I can tell you want to get in on this, and then I'll come right to you, Patrice. Pieter, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I don't agree that this is confined to Britain or the British Conservative Party. If you look at France, there's a Eurosceptic tradition there. French people only very narrowly supported introducing the euro when they voted on the Treaty of Maastricht. In Scandinavia, there's a long tradition of left-wing Euroscepticism, and also in recent years we've seen that there's a lot of criticism on the European project all over the continent, even in Germany now. Even in Belgium, I'm Belgian myself, the two biggest party of the country, they have expressed EU critical ideas in various ways, without, however, attacking the EU project in itself. Typically, people are very happy with trade cooperation, but they just don't want all this overreach, this grand federalist daydreaming, Brussels managing all kinds of very sensitive things like transfers and national budgets, and then having it wrong.
Patrice, do you agree with that some of these issues are going to continue to bubble up in other countries?
Yes, it's going to bother other countries, but I would not agree. I would rather strongly disagree with what has just been said. Yes, Britain is a special case. Yes, Britain always has reservations about the EU. Yes, the UK always wanted to get from the EU things that other countries didn't want to have. Yes, Britain is the first country who has to leave the EU. Britain is an island. It is true that there is a lot of resentment against Brussels in all European countries. It's a resentment which is understandable. It's true that Brussels is meddling with a lot of things. But in fact, what is happening in Brussels is something which is being decided by governments, the British government as well as the French or the German or the Greek governments. Then they have bills passed in Brussels by the Commission, by the European Parliament, and they come back to their own people saying Brussels has imposed us this, Brussels has imposed us that. Whereas all these, none of these bills, none of these regulations could have been adopted without the full consent of all members, who all have a right of veto. It is true that we are not terribly happy with Brussels, but at the same time, the National Front in France is 25% of voters. It is quite impossible for the moment to think that France or Germany or even the Netherlands could opt out. If our politicians would need to be even worse than they are for this thing to happen, I think.
Florian, do you agree with that sometimes the EU is just getting scapegoated?
Yes, sure. And sometimes it's also that the national elites are more unpopular than the European elites. The EU definitely is a scapegoat for many fields, and it was not a problem of the EU with the refugee crisis. Basically, it was caused by Angela Merkel, who said that we open up the borders and have to take them in without coordinating that on the European level. So, of course, the European Union is a scapegoat for campaigning and also for wrong understanding, and the EU can't solve all these troubles what we are facing right now.
Okay, having said that, Peter, are there things that the EU can and should do to learn from what has happened, some reforms that they should consider, that they should discuss?
Yes, absolutely. I think they should scrap the whole political aspect of the EU to start with would be to scrap the idea to impose mandatory quotas for refugees. Indeed, the EU in itself was largely innocent when it comes to the refugee crisis, but then the EU tried to abuse the crisis to grab more powers. The idea that you can spread out refugees in a passport-free zone is not correct. It's very unpractical. If you tell people to go to Poland, they can the next day take the bus to Germany if they feel like, and that's not a bad thing. I mean, we should keep Schengen. Schengen is a great achievement of the European Union, but I don't think Brussels and officials in Brussels should be deciding very sensitive issues like how many asylum seekers should go to Poland. This is already very hard for national politicians to decide. Everywhere in the world, there's nothing weird about that. So what we've seen is that when the EU, actually inspired by Angela Merkel, tried to impose this grand scheme of relocating refugees in a mandatory way, this created a lot of anti-EU sentiment in Central and Eastern Europe, where previously people are actually generally quite happy with the EU project. So sometimes the European Union is its own worst enemy.
Florian, you touched on this earlier, and I think that this is worth drilling down on. What role does Angela Merkel play in the future of the EU?
I think Germany will have much more responsibility now due to the Brexit. Already Juncker, the president of the Commission, said that Germany basically has to do the things, because what's the alternative? The alternative is, you saw that Poland basically is very skeptical with the new government. France is under shock, also Belgium after the terrorism, and who else can do it? The South countries have big financial problems, so basically it's up to Germany, but actually Germany is more soft power and thinking more in the economical terms. So actually it's a very challenging situation right now, and the problem for the Euroscepticism is indeed the migration crisis, which was on the European and national level quite underestimated. We already knew since a few years that the migration topic will be the hottest and most sensitive topic in Europe due to the developments in Syria and Iraq, but actually we were too late, and now we are actually paying with this Brexit. I think the Brexit basically was a result of this refugee crisis, as well like the last elections in Europe with the rise of the populists.
I think you said it best when you said that this is quite challenging, and that's going to have to be all for now, gentlemen. Thank you all very much to all of our guests, Pieter Cleppe, Patrice de Beer, and Florian Hartleb. And thank you for watching. You can see the program again anytime. Just go to our website, aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That is facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is AJ Inside Story. For me, Richelle, Carey, and the entire team, bye for now.